Hello, and welcome back to the Brain and Psychology. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is a part of the brain you see here, the outermost portion of the brain, the biggest portion of the human's brain. The cerebral cortex is a convoluted layer of gray matter. Our brain is divided into gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is the outer part of the brain, where a lot of the memory storage and activity takes place. The center part of the brain is white matter, which are nerve tracts. Our cerebral cortex is the part of the brain that's responsible for the highest level of neural processing, those things that make us truly human. Our perception of our environment, when we formulate new ideas, our memories and when we recall past events, our ability to command our body to move, and integrating complex thoughts and complex movements all occur in our cerebral cortex. Another name for our cerebral cortex is the cerebrum. The cerebrum has 4 different lobes, and each lobe has a specialized function. We'll look at each one in detail, but in a quick overview, the frontal lobe at the front of the brain is responsible for our muscle movement and higher thought processes. The occipital lobe in the very back of our brain is responsible for our sense of vision. Our parietal lobe on the side of our brain is responsible for our sense of touch. And our temporal lobe, right above our ears, right behind our temple, is responsible for our sense of hearing and other senses as well. Let's start with the frontal lobe. Our frontal lobe is right behind our forehead. We're going to look at 3 areas of our frontal lobe. We're going to start with the prefrontal association area. You notice in the lower right-hand corner, there's a diagram that says thinking. The black and gray areas are the part of the brain that are most active when we think. And by thinking, I mean idea generation, solving problems, higher thought processes, and those aspects of our brain that make our personality. The blue area of the brain, the very front part, is that part of the brain where our thought processes occur. As we move back, we'll come to a portion of the brain. In this diagram, it's purple. And that's our primary motor cortex. Our brain obviously controls our muscle movement, but it's this portion of the brain that is responsible for flexing our biceps, walking, any kind of muscle movement we do. You'll notice the central sulcus is also labeled. The central sulcus is a deep groove that separates the frontal lobe from the rest of the brain. That primary motor cortex, just in front of that central sulcus, is responsible for movement, and as you can see, a diagram called the motor homunculus. It shows how much of the brain is devoted to muscle movement in each part of the body. It's not evenly distributed. We don't need a whole bunch of nervous control of, let's say, our thighs or our stomach or our ears. We need a lot of motor control for our hands and our fingers. Fine dexterity. We have very small muscles, but we can do a lot of things with our hands. If you look on the motor homunculus, you'll notice that his lips and tongue are extremely big. That's because it takes a lot of motor control to speak. As we move on down, we'll come to a special area called Broca's area, due to a scientist who first discovered this area. Broca's area is the area where we start to form our words. So speech formation is in that pink area labeled Broca's area. It's just in the bottom of the frontal lobe. Let's stop for a brain scan. The frontal lobe controls our ability to speak, our sense of touch, our sense of smell, our ability to understand words. If you said our frontal lobe controls our ability to speak, you're correct. It controls our ability to speak, our ability to think, and our muscle movement. If you thought it might be our ability to understand words, we'll come to that part of the brain later. What two areas of our body have the largest proportion of the motor cortex devoted to it? Lips, arms, hands, or legs? If you said lips and hands, you are correct. As we move back in the brain, we come to the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe are basically right at the sides of our brain. The parietal lobe basically is responsible for our sense of touch. It receives sensory input from all areas of our body that helps us know where we are in space. That's proprioception. So we know we're standing up. We know we're not swaying. If we do a flip, we know we're flipping. That's all proprioception. So we know where our body is in space. Our somatosthetic sensations are our sense of touch. We also have a sensory homunculus. So the amount of our brain that's devoted to relaying sensory input from our body. And again, the areas of our body with the most sensory nerve endings are our hands for our sense of touch in our fingertips, and our lips and our tongue. That might be one reason why kissing is so important to humans, because our sense of touch in our lips is so incredibly important. Let's stop for a brain scan. What is the primary function of the parietal lobe? Interpreting incoming tactile sensations for touch, interpreting incoming olfactory sensations for smell, control the motor movements of our muscles, control our ability to speak. Hopefully you said interpret incoming tactile sensations for touch. The back of our brain is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is right here behind your brain. The occipital lobe is responsible for our sense of vision. You can see in the diagram to the lower right, when we are seeing something, the part of our brain that is active is the rear part of the brain, our occipital lobe. It's shown in green here in this diagram. Not only is our sense of vision in that location, but also we store our memories in that location for facial features and for visual things. Our memories are stored all over the brain, but when we're thinking about visual memory, it will be stored in the occipital lobe. This PET scan shows the most blood flow and the most activity by the color red. So you can see the color red is most obvious in the occipital lobe when somebody is remembering a face. Time for another brain scan. The arrow on the diagram is pointing to what structure? Is it the occipital lobe, primary sensory cortex, Broca's area, primary motor cortex? If you said Broca's area, you're correct. The Broca's area, just as a reminder, is the area that is responsible for the production of speech. Let's move on to the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is right above your ears, and as such, it's going to be also responsible for our sense of hearing. What else does our temporal lobe do? Our temporal lobe is responsible for our sense of smell and taste. In fact, our olfactory nerves from our nose come directly into that olfactory cortex for our sense of smell. And our sense of smell are intricately linked. If we move up to the top of the temporal lobe, we come to the area responsible for hearing and understanding what we hear. So the area associated with speech recognition, so we understand what we're hearing when somebody's speaking, is called Wernicke's area. We also have other areas responsible for hearing. When you're hearing words, again, in the diagram, the brain is red, that's most active. And again, you can see those are in the auditory areas at the temporal lobe. Another important function of our temporal lobe is our limbic association cortex. Our limbic association cortex is responsible for our memory and emotions. An interesting feature in our temporal lobe is somebody who has temporal lobe epilepsy. Temporal lobe epilepsy is our seizures in the temporal lobe that don't cause muscular seizures, but what they cause are auditory hallucinations. So when the temporal lobe starts seizing, people start hearing things that aren't there. Another interesting aspect of temporal lobe epilepsy is it's very often associated with a deep religious experience and a deep sense of awe. They might look at the world as a much better place. So our sense of being spiritual is very much centered in our temporal lobe. Connecting with that is what happens when your brain is in love. When our brain is in love and we think about the person that we're in love with, we have a distinctly different reaction in our brain. You'll notice a couple of areas in red here. All in the temporal lobe, we have a lot of activity in the temporal lobe, meaning we're in this dream state, this high emotional state that our temporal lobe is responsible for. You can also see there's some activity back in the occipital lobe, and that activity is probably when we're thinking and visualizing that person we love. There's also some high activity back in the frontal lobe because we're thinking about the person we love. So there's some distinctly different activity when a person in love thinks about the object of his affection. Not only is electrical activity different when we're in love, our chemical activity is different in the brain. I'm just going to look at two different chemicals, and that's dopamine and oxytocin. Those are our two chemicals of love. Our dopamine is actually a chemical we'll talk about quite a bit because it's a chemical that is responsible for high anticipation. So dopamine levels tend to be very high in the sex act, very high when we are anticipating anything pleasurable. It's kind of a pleasure hormone, but it's more an anticipation hormone. So when dopamine is high, our pleasure is high, our motivation is high, and our sadness is low. We're in love. Oxytocin is a bonding hormone. Oxytocin is high anytime we have a lot of body touching, parents hugging their children, mothers nursing their babies, husband and wife hugging each other, lovers making love. Oxytocin will be high. When that happens, trust is high, attachment is high, and fear is low. Let's stop for a brain scan. Which area of the brain is responsible for comprehending language? We have both Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Which one is responsible for comprehending language? If you said Wernicke's area, you're right. Broca's area is responsible for producing speech, Wernicke's area for comprehending speech. So we've looked at all areas of the cerebrum, and we've talked about the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Now we've said each area of the cerebrum has its specialized functions. I don't want you to think that that's the only way the brain works. In fact, if we look at a brain scan when somebody is normally active, you'll see activity all over the brain. So we store memories in different locations, we speak using different locations, we think different locations. So complex thinking and processing requires a large amount of brain activity. It's not focused in just one area, even though the predominant activity will be in one area, just as we talked about with the major function of those lobes.